Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining me for Quigley House University this month. We are excited to dive into our lesson for today, and we're going to be talking about trauma, mental health, and intimate partner violence. My name is Ellissa Jordan. I am the Community Relations Coordinator here at Quigley House, and let's go ahead and dive right in. So in case you are unaware, May is Mental Health Awareness Month, and this has been observed in the US since 1949. And each year, millions of Americans face the reality of living with mental illness. Mental Health Awareness Month provides an opportunity to shine a spotlight on spreading helpful information regarding mental health resources, content, and other things like that to your followers, your friends, your communities. And we encourage people to, take action through voting for mental health or advocating for improving our nation's crisis response. And you can check out more information at NAMI.org, which is the National American Mental Institute, and it's NAMI.org. So when we talk about mental health, we also want to address domestic violence because that's kind of what we're going to tie in together. So what is domestic violence or intimate partner violence? So the legal definition established by Florida Statute 74128, domestic violence means the assault, aggravated assault, battery, aggravated battery, sexual assault, sexual battery, stalking, aggravated stalking, kidnapping, false imprisonment, or any other criminal offense resulting in physical injury or death of one family member or household member by another family or household member. So in layman's terms, domestic violence is the willful intimidation, physical assault, battery, sexual assault, or any other abusive behavior as a part of a systematic pattern of power and control perpetrated by one intimate partner against another. So that can include physical violence, sexual violence, threats, and emotional or psychological abuse, economic abuse. The frequency and the severity of domestic violence varies dramatically from relationship to relationship. And we recognize that any person can be involved in a domestic violence relationship, regardless of their age, gender, sexual orientation, nationality, religion, race. Domestic violence can affect everyone. So obviously an important part of talking about domestic violence and those very traumatic things is identifying what exactly trauma is. So trauma is a response to a distressing event, and it results in a fundamental reorganization of the way the mind and brain manage your perceptions. So trauma is not exclusive to just physical or sexual assault. It can manifest in many different ways and be brought on by many different types of traumatic events. Some of those traumatic events could include child abuse or neglect, human trafficking, loss or death of a family member, car accident, injuries, physical assaults, military combat, natural disasters, witnessing other people's traumas, and prejudices as a whole. So that could be cultural trauma, religious trauma, whatever. So there is no one size fits all trauma that you can tie to every situation. Every single situation and every single person reacts and responds to trauma differently. So what is the connection between intimate partner violence, trauma, and mental health? So IPV, or intimate partner violence, is associated with a range of trauma-related health and mental health effects. Being victimized by an intimate partner increases one's risk for developing depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, substance abuse, and suicide, as well as a range of chronic health conditions. Many survivors experience multiple forms of trauma over the course of their lives, further increasing their risk for developing trauma-related health or mental health conditions. In addition, individuals who perpetrate IPV often actively undermine their partner's wellness, mental health, and sobriety, and control their access to treatments and other supports, which also contribute to adverse health and mental health effects. So that is all coming from the National Center for Domestic Violence, Trauma, and Mental Health. They have a ton of really great resources on there, and we're going to talk about a couple of the examples that we have just talked about a second ago. So some common conditions that you associate with trauma, are depression, PTSD, self-harming, suicide, eating disorders, other anxiety and mood disorders, substance use and abuse, and poor sleep. I do want to note that the connections between domestic violence, mental health, and substance abuse are very, very in-depth. And so we will be diving into that topic in more detail at a later training. But today we just want to kind of talk about mental health and trauma in general, so that way we can make sure that we cover the spectrum. So you may have heard of the 4 common trauma responses, or actually you might have only heard of 3. So usually when you think of trauma responses, or how would you react to a traumatic event, you think of fight, flight, or freeze, but we also identified that there is also fawn. That is a trauma response as well. So when we're talking about the fight trauma response, the fight response is self-preservation, and for people using it, it doesn't matter who they hurt in the process. In some cases, the fight response is healthy and helpful. For example, if a wild animal were to attack you, trying to fight back against that animal, depending on the animal, that might be helpful in that situation. And if for some reason, if you were just having a verbal altercation with somebody and they started to belittle you or call you incorrect names or something, standing up for yourself and fighting back in that aspect would be a healthy way to respond. So when used in a positive way, fight response looks like creating boundaries, being assertive, finding courage to stand your ground, and protecting yourself when necessary. However, when someone has been exposed to intense trauma over time, the fight response can become unhealthy. And for some people, it may feel as though the threat of that tiger never went away. So they feel like they're always on high alert, or you get some things like this. So temper, angry outbursts, aggression, demanding perfection from others. You are then pursuing power and control, bullying others. So that's kind of what wraps into the fight response when it comes to trauma. And you may have learned any one of these behaviors, or activated any one of these fight responses in order to survive and be safe. That's okay. What's important is to recognize that you don't need to respond that way forever. Some people had to fight to survive, especially when it comes to an intimate partner relationship, or if there was, extensive violence that occurred. Fighting may have been the only way you got through it, and that's okay. We just want to make sure that coping and working through those things to respond in an appropriate way is okay too. So when we talk about flight, we're talking about feelings of panic or anxiety, obsessive and or compulsive behaviors, always on the go and staying busy, over worrying, hyperactive. So in a healthy situation, a flight response to stress can be to disengage from harmful conversations, leaving the unhealthy relationships, removing yourself from physically dangerous situations before they escalate, and properly assessing danger. The flight response is an important one to be able to access in a healthy way, so that way you can sense real danger and leave it whenever possible. However, some people with unresolved trauma may perceive everything as a danger, leading to unhealthy flight responses, which can lead to those particular responses that we just listed, or even just an overall sense of fear and panic. And that's where that anxiety disorders or things like that come into play. So now we're going to talk about our freeze response. So sometimes you may have heard this when you're talking about, somebody witnessed somebody being robbed and they just froze. they couldn't make a decision one way or whether to fight or flee. And that's typically something we hear many times when they're playing possum or they're like a deer in headlights. We want to make sure that if we are accessing the freeze response in a healthy way, we are being mindful of the situation. So pausing to kind of take in what's happening, process, and then react appropriately. Having awareness, being fully present in that moment. And the freeze, like with any of these, there can be unhealthy ways to react to trauma. And for example, an unhealthy way that the freeze response might come into effect would be if like a child has an abusive parent, they may be still and quiet as possible to avoid the parent's wrath. Or someone may become so overwhelmed by fear in a threatening situation that they cannot move, which is what we just talked about, being a deer in headlights, being stuck. And it can cause these things listed above. So depression, dissociation, brain fog, being detached, being unable to make decisions, kind of hibernating, feeling spaced out, or some people feel dead inside or isolated. That's also something that is important to address, that we're doing in a healthy way too. And then we're going to talk about the fawn response. Typically, most people don't recognize the fawn response as a trauma response, but it's only because we have not educated them. But fawning is the least known trauma response, and it is primarily related to people pleasing. So individuals who spend a lot of time around toxic people sometimes learn to go above and beyond to make that toxic person happy, thus neutralizing the threat of trauma. In some cases, fawning can be productive. For example, if you throw a piece of meat at a dog that's chasing you, you might just distract them long enough to use your flight response and escape. Healthy fawning can result in, compassion for others, compromise, active listening. And the fawn response when it comes to trauma, can cause codependent relationships, having a hard time saying no, lack of boundaries, avoiding conflict altogether. And all of these things is it's a self-inventory of how you have reacted to trauma in the past, seeing how, we can work through to avoid the unhealthy behaviors that are associated with trauma response and work towards being healthier individuals in general. And coping with trauma, healing from trauma is a journey, and nobody is expected to do everything perfect all the time. Nobody is expected to just get over trauma. And so that's why it's important that when we are talking about trauma and we're talking about how to support someone or yourself when they're experiencing trauma. So we always want to focus on a trauma-informed approach when we are addressing any sort of situation that, involves a trauma that, like the examples we listed earlier. So like sexual violence, domestic violence, child abuse, car accidents, natural disasters. We want to make sure that we are accessing a trauma-informed approach when we are addressing these situations, to make sure that, number one, we are taking care of the person who has experienced the trauma, and we're making sure that they are not being traumatized even further, and that we are making sure we are taking care of us as well, because you might be experiencing secondary trauma or vicarious trauma in the process. So we want to make sure that everybody is doing it in a healthy way that makes sure that it does not damage their mental health or their psyche even further. So when we talk about a trauma-informed approach, we are kind of using the SAMHSA's National Center, or the National Center for Trauma-Informed Care. There's 6 guiding principles of trauma-informed approach. So that starts with safety, addressing safety, making sure that the situation is safe to continue, building that trustworthiness and transparency when it comes to addressing issues or needs at hand, accessing peer support. So not necessarily finding somebody who can agree that they've experienced exactly what you have experienced, but finding somebody who will listen, understand be there to support, working with other people to collaborate and come to a mutual understanding of how we can approach whatever the situation is. Empowerment and choice. Ultimately, every person should have autonomy over their own choices, their own body, their own healing process. And so it's important to support that. And then obviously addressing cultural, historical, and gender issues to make sure that we are not re-traumatizing or traumatizing somebody even further who has also had those additional barriers or generational trauma inflicted upon them. So adopting a trauma-informed approach is not accomplished through any single particular technique or checklist. It requires constant attention, caring, awareness, sensitivity, and possibly a cultural change to on an organizational level. So ongoing internal organizational assessment and quality improvement is important if you are a service provider for people who have endured trauma, but also as community members, it's important to kind of address how you as a community deal with people who have experienced trauma and provide that education and access those resources that are addressing these things in an appropriate and healthy way. So if somebody discloses to you that they have experienced a trauma, listen, validate them, thank them for being brave enough to tell you. This may be the first time they've ever shared this traumatic event with somebody, and the last thing that they need is to feel judged, shamed, guilty. It is hard enough to come forward with a trauma without having to feel as though you have to you have to prove or you have to explain why this happened to you, because it happened. And we just need to validate and support them. And then after they disclose, we need to provide continual support as allies, as advocates, as friends, as family members. Ask them what they need. And the answer, if it's nothing, that's okay. I'm here to support you with whatever you need, even if you don't know what that is right now. Offer them resources if they have struggled with, if they have been through a natural disaster, there's National Disaster Hotline. If they are struggling with depression or suicidal ideation, there's the National Suicide Lifeline. There are resources to assist and provide care for multiple different types of trauma. And so it's just kind of accessing those resources and finding the appropriate person to help them through that if that's not you. And also, if you are helping somebody through a traumatic incident, take care of yourself as well. A lot of the times when we are helping someone, we are seeing someone we care about go through things, we are also experiencing those things as well. We are experiencing that secondhand trauma, and it's important that we take care of ourselves as well, and while we're helping them take care of them. So that's engaging in self-care, taking time for your mental health, taking breaks when you need it, making sure that you have appropriate support and resources as well. So some general tips when you are talking to people about trauma and kind of working through whatever the scenario is. Remember bodily autonomy. So do not touch them unless you ask consent first. Make sure you guys are, sometimes it's easier to have a hard conversation, especially about some sort of trauma when you're not facing each other. So that might be sitting facing a different direction. Ask them which area they would prefer. Some people, experienced a traumatic incident at night in a dim setting. So being in that scenario again, or being in that setting again, may be triggering. So ask them where they feel comfortable having the conversation, whether that's a well-lit area, that's in public, that's somewhere private, a little bit more intimate and dim. Ask them how they need you to support them and find a location where they do feel comfortable and safe enough to open up. Triggers can be of any of the senses. So again, it's making sure that you even if you don't know the exacts, of the situation, be, confident or have a backup place that you might need just in case they do become triggered. And so you need to move locations or retry having a conversation in a different location, different time, different place. Remember that resources are available. If you know that a person has gone through something and they want to talk with you, but you haven't got confirmation yet, bring some resources. But don't just offer them up without them asking for them. Don't just have them handy just in case they would like them. But again, it's their decision whether they would like to access resources, whether they would like to learn about resources. They might just need somebody to listen in that moment. They don't need help. And self-care is necessary. So if you are having that difficult conversation, it's important to make sure that you're doing it at a comfortable pace. You are taking time to stop and kind of ground yourself, revisit self-care when necessary. And after that incident, do something that you love. Go for a walk in the park to decompress. Go pamper yourself, whatever you need to kind of decompress and, do that self-care that you need. So these are some general tips when it comes to talking to somebody about trauma. And then as we kind of wrap up, there are several different resources that you can access if you have experienced trauma. If you have experienced domestic violence, sexual violence, you can always call our 24-hour crisis helpline here at Quigley House, and that number is 904-284-0061. If you have experienced sexual violence in the state of Florida and you are unsure where your nearest sexual or rape crisis center is, you can visit fcasv.org, and they have a list of all of the rape crisis and sexual violence centers throughout the state. If you have been through a natural disaster and need some assistance, some counseling, whatever, you can call the disaster distress hotline, which is 1-800-985-5990. If you are struggling with suicidal thoughts, hopelessness, you can contact the 24-hour Lifeline from the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 1-800-273-TALK or 1-800-273-8255. If you are a veteran and you are experiencing PTSD or combat-related trauma, please reach out to the Veterans Crisis Line at 1-800-273-8255, or you can press 1 and text, or you can text the number 1 to 838-255. There is a national 24-hour crisis text line that can connect you to the counseling and things like that. You can text hello to 741-741. And then if you have experienced child abuse or suspect child abuse or even need to access different resources throughout the state of Florida, you can reach out or you can visit the Department of Children and Families website at myfloridafamilies.com. So I want to thank you so much for joining me today to talk about trauma, mental health, and intimate partner violence, and kind of how to navigate traumatic situations with people you care about. If you need any assistance, again, our 24-hour crisis helpline is 904-284-0061. My contact information is on the screen, and I encourage you to follow us on Facebook at Quigley House and Instagram at Quigley_House. Excuse me. We have different resources, infographics, activities, all kinds of stuff that we post all the time. So please check out those things, and thank you so much for joining us today. And I hope that you have a great rest of Mental Health Awareness Month, and make sure you are taking time this month to focus a little bit on you and your mental health. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.